The old concert hall always felt like a place caught between the past and the present, like it still held echoes of something people no longer remembered. During the day, it stayed mostly empty except for a few staff members who moved quietly through the wide corridors. But at night, when the last visitors were gone and the lights dimmed, the building seemed to breathe in a different way. That was when the teenage janitor arrived for his shift, pushing open the heavy side door with a soft creak that blended into the darkness. He was used to silence. He liked it, in fact. Silence made things clear. Silence didn't judge him or push him to talk when he didn't feel like it. Most people at his school saw him as the quiet type, someone who kept to himself. But here, in this huge space where sound carried like a living thing, he didn't mind being alone. His job wasn't complicated. He swept the aisles, dusted the railings, checked the bins under the seats, and wiped down the backstage areas. It was routine, predictable, steady work, something he could do without thinking too hard. But even while doing his tasks, his eyes drifted again and again to the grand piano sitting on the stage. It wasn't in perfect shape anymore. The paint around the edges had faded, and a few keys had scratches from years of use. But to him, it still looked beautiful, almost magical. He had always felt drawn to music, even though he had never taken formal lessons. He learned by listening, copying the notes he heard in old recordings or online videos. His fingers understood the keys in a way he couldn't explain, as if the piano spoke a language he had always known. Every night, before starting his shift, he took a slow walk across the stage just to glance at the piano. He tried not to get too close because he knew it wasn't his. He didn't want to break any rules or lose his job, especially since he needed the money to help at home. Still, each night, the pull felt stronger, like the instrument was inviting him to sit for just a moment. He resisted at first. He told himself it was better not to get involved, better to focus on cleaning and finishing early. But the truth was that the hall felt incomplete without music, and he felt incomplete without playing. Sometimes, when he swept the front rows, he imagined what it would be like to sit on stage while a full audience watched in silence, waiting for the first note. He imagined his hands moving with confidence, his body steady, his heart calm even as every seat filled. But those were just thoughts, small daydreams he never expected to become anything real. One night, after he had been working there for a few months, the urge to touch the piano became too strong to ignore. He had finished most of his tasks earlier than usual, and the hall was darker than normal, lit only by a single soft beam from the emergency light above the stage. The quiet felt almost heavy, pressing gently on his shoulders. He stood at the edge of the stage for a long moment, broom still in his hand, staring at the piano as if waiting for a sign. Eventually, he placed the broom against a seat and walked toward the instrument. Each step felt strange and careful, like he was crossing into a place he didn't quite have permission to enter. When he reached the piano bench, he hesitated again. His fingers hovered over the lid, afraid to lift it. But then he thought about all the times he had walked away, all the nights he had wished for just one chance to feel the keys beneath his hands. Slowly, he lifted the cover, revealing the neat row of white and black keys. He sat down. The bench creaked softly under his weight. He placed his hands lightly on the keys without pressing them, letting the cool surface settle under his fingertips. The hall stayed silent, as if listening. Finally, he pressed one key. A single soft note filled the room, echoing up into the empty balcony and back to him. Something inside him relaxed. He played another note, then another, and soon a gentle melody formed. He didn't play loudly. He didn't want anyone to hear from outside. But in that empty space, the sound felt bigger than anything he had ever created before. His fingers moved on their own, guided by memory, emotion, and something deeper that he couldn't fully understand. The music wasn't perfect. Some notes slipped. Some chords didn't land the way he intended. But that didn't matter. What mattered was how it made him feel. For the first time in a long while, he felt free, like the heaviness he carried in his chest loosened with every key he touched. The hall, which usually felt cold and forgotten, suddenly felt alive again, like it had been waiting for this moment as much as he had. He played for only a few minutes before forcing himself to stop. He didn't want to get carried away. He reminded himself that he had a job to finish, chores to complete before the morning staff returned. With a deep breath, he closed the piano lid carefully and stood up. His legs felt lighter. His chest felt calmer. Even though the moment was brief, it changed something inside him. For the rest of the night, as he finished cleaning, he kept replaying the melody in his head. His steps felt quicker, and time seemed to pass effortlessly. When he finally left through the side door, locking it behind him, he glanced back at the building with a new sense of connection. He had touched something precious, and it had touched him back. The next night, he tried to ignore the piano again, telling himself it was better to keep things simple. But once more, the sight of it drew him in. He waited until he finished most of his work, then sat down and played quietly for a little longer than the night before. Each evening, he returned, staying just long enough to feel the music settle inside him. The hall became his secret sanctuary. The piano became a part of his routine, a part he looked forward to more than anything else. No one knew what he did after the lights dimmed and the doors were locked. No one knew how the music changed the way he walked, the way he breathed. But for him, those moments made the long days easier, giving him something bright to hold on to. He didn't think his playing would ever matter beyond those four walls. He didn't expect anyone to hear it or care. To him, it was simply a quiet part of his life, something small and personal. But what he didn't know was that the hall wasn't as empty as he believed. Someone else had begun noticing the soft melodies drifting through the shadows. Someone who had been listening longer than he realized. And the music he thought belonged only to the night was slowly finding its way into the world beyond the empty seats. The following nights became a quiet routine for him, almost like a secret rhythm that guided his steps from the moment he entered the building. He would arrive with his backpack slung over one shoulder, clock in, and move through the halls with the usual slow pace. But beneath that calm, there was a quiet excitement that only he understood. He tried not to show it on his face, yet the feeling pushed him forward in small ways. How he walked a little quicker when passing the lobby, how he glanced toward the doors to make sure no one else was around, how he held his breath when he stepped onto the dark stage. The piano had become more than an instrument. It had become something he looked forward to every day. Even when he swept the aisles or emptied the trash, his mind was already jumping ahead to the moment he would sit on the bench again. He knew he wasn't supposed to be touching the piano. He knew it belonged to the hall and not to him. Still, something about those late-night moments made him feel like he belonged there in a way he hadn't felt anywhere else. Every night, after finishing most of his tasks, he walked up the steps that led to the stage. The wood floor creaked beneath his shoes, but only softly, as if the hall understood this was their secret. The air always felt cooler on stage, carrying faint hints of polish, dust, and something old that still lingered from the days when musicians played here regularly. He would sit down slowly, almost carefully, as though he didn't want to disturb the memories floating in the room. The first few minutes were always the same. He placed his fingers on the keys, waited, breathed, and then began to play. The notes came gently at first, soft enough that even the shadows barely reacted. He didn't play anything too complicated. He just played what he felt. Some melodies came from songs he had heard online. Others were things he had created on his own without even realizing it. Sometimes the music came out shaky. Sometimes it came out smooth. But it always came from a place he didn't show anyone in his daily life. The hall seemed to listen. Every sound stretched up to the high ceiling and washed back down like a warm wave. When he made mistakes, the hall didn't judge him. When he paused, it didn't rush him. It let him be exactly who he was, quiet, unsure, but deeply connected to something bigger than himself. He didn't know someone else had started noticing a change in the building. The security guard on the night shift had begun hearing faint music on evenings when the hallway lights flickered. At first, the guard thought it was his imagination, a memory from the past when concerts were common and rehearsals filled the halls. But the music grew clearer over time. It wasn't loud, but it carried through the corridors in a way that felt intentional, almost like it was reaching out to anyone who cared enough to listen. The guard didn't interrupt or walk in on him during those early nights. Instead, he listened quietly from a distance, unsure who was playing but certain the sound was real. The music had a simplicity that made it different from professional performances. It wasn't polished. It wasn't perfect. Yet it had a feeling to it that the guard hadn't heard in years, a kind of honesty that made even the empty hall seem warmer. But the janitor knew none of this. To him, the hall was still empty, still silent except for the sound of his fingers moving over the keys. He was so focused on playing that he never once looked toward the darker corners or noticed the faint light reflecting off the guard's uniform from afar. He thought he was alone, and the thought made him brave in ways he never allowed himself to be outside these walls. There were nights when he played longer than usual, letting the emotions of the day flow through the notes. If he had a difficult day at school, the music came out heavier, full of low chords that echoed like gentle thunder. If he felt hopeful, his hands lifted into lighter melodies that skipped across the keys like dancing water. He didn't plan any of it. He just followed the feeling inside him, letting the piano carry it without asking for anything in return. One night, after a long shift at school and a tiring evening at work, he came to the stage feeling drained. His backpack felt heavier than usual. His eyes felt tired. He sat at the piano, unsure if he had the energy to play. But the moment he touched the keys, something in him shifted. The music that came out wasn't strong or bold. It was soft and slow, almost like a whisper trying to comfort him. He closed his eyes as he played, letting the notes wrap around him. In the back of the hall, the guard watched from behind a row of seats. He didn't move or speak. He didn't want to interrupt the moment. Something about the way the teenager played tugged at a part of the guard's heart that he thought he had left behind years ago. He found himself leaning forward slightly, feeling the emotion in the melody. The hall, quiet as ever, felt almost alive with the sound. The teenager finally stopped playing after a long pause, his hands resting on the keys. He let out a slow breath, the kind that comes only when the weight of the day begins to slip away. He sat there for another moment before standing up and closing the lid gently. Then he walked back to finish the last bits of cleaning before heading home. The guard waited until he disappeared backstage before letting out a breath of his own. He knew now without a doubt that the music wasn't coming from a random recording or an old speaker. It was coming from the janitor. And it wasn't just good, it was raw and meaningful in a way that wasn't taught in lessons. It was the kind of talent that deserved more than empty seats. But the guard didn't say anything that night. He didn't reveal himself or call out. He wasn't sure how the teen would react if he knew he had been heard. Instead, he kept watching, listening, and thinking about what to do. As for the teenager, he walked home with a small sense of peace. Even though the world outside felt challenging and complicated, the concert hall remained his quiet corner, his secret haven. The place where he didn't have to speak or explain himself. The music did that for him. He didn't know that his midnight ritual was beginning to change more than just his own world. He didn't know that someone else saw something in him that he himself couldn't see yet. And he didn't know that a simple melody played after midnight would soon ripple into something far bigger than he ever expected. The hall wasn't just listening anymore. It was holding a secret, one that was slowly preparing to unfold. The next few nights continued in the same quiet rhythm, but something in the air had shifted. The teenager didn't notice it at first. He still walked into the concert hall with his usual calm steps, still carried out his tasks with careful focus, and still waited until the building felt fully silent before making his way toward the stage. But if he had paid closer attention, he might have sensed that he was no longer as alone as he believed. The guard had become a silent witness to his late-night music, returning again and again to the same dark corner of the hall whenever the soft notes drifted through the air. At first, the guard only listened, but soon, curiosity began to grow alongside admiration. He wanted to see the teenager more clearly, to understand how someone so young played with such emotion. He had spent years around musicians, students, performers, even professionals, and yet none had touched him the way these late-night melodies did. One evening, before the teenager arrived, the guard walked slowly down the aisle, looking up at the stage. The piano sat under the dim emergency light, its silhouette almost glowing in the stillness. The guard felt something stir in him, a memory of his old life when he used to teach. He placed a hand on the back of a seat and sighed softly. He missed those days more than he liked to admit. When the teenager finally entered through the side door, unaware that the guard was only a few steps away, he seemed more tired than usual. His shoulders carried a heaviness, and his eyes revealed a long day that hadn't been kind to him. He didn't notice the guard stepping deeper into the shadows as he walked past. Once again, he completed his tasks with quiet focus, keeping his emotions tucked away. But as soon as he stepped onto the stage, something in him softened. The piano was like a magnet, pulling him closer until he finally sat down. He hesitated only a second before lifting the lid. That night, the melody he played was different. It began with slow, low notes that stretched into the air like they were searching for somewhere to rest. Then, gradually, the sound grew stronger, building into something that carried both pain and hope. The music told a story he couldn't put into words. A story of long days, uncertain moments, and small dreams he hardly dared to acknowledge. From the shadows, the guard listened, his eyes reflecting the faint glow from the emergency light. He didn't blink much, afraid to lose a second of the moment. He had heard talented people perform on that stage in the past, but something about this teenager's playing felt more honest than anything else he had experienced. For the first time, the guard lifted his phone and recorded a short clip. He did it almost without thinking, as if the music itself guided his hand. The recording wasn't meant for anything special. He didn't plan to show it to anyone yet. He simply wanted to capture the feeling, to hold onto something beautiful in a world that often felt heavy. He stopped recording after less than a minute and slipped his phone into his pocket. But he kept watching, leaning forward just a little, completely absorbed. The teenager had no idea he was being observed. In his mind, the hall was still empty, still guarding his secret. He continued to play, letting the music spill out of him until he finally paused. He sat there for a long moment, staring at the keys, breathing quietly. He didn't cry, but there was a sadness in the stillness of his body that spoke louder than tears. The guard felt a tug of concern. He wished he could step out and say something, anything that might offer comfort. But he stayed hidden, unable to break the unspoken understanding between them, even though the teenager wasn't aware of it yet. When the boy finally closed the piano lid and stood up to finish the rest of his shift, the guard slipped back into the hallway. He didn't want to risk being seen. He needed time to think, to understand what was happening inside him. The building had been quiet for so long, filled mostly with memories of performances that had come and gone. But now, it felt like someone had reignited a spark he thought had died years ago. The next night, the guard returned early and sat again in his hidden corner. He had convinced himself that watching over the teenager was part of his duty, but deep down, he knew there was more to it. The music gave him a sense of purpose again. It reminded him of the days when he used to guide young musicians, encouraging them to find their own voice. When the teenager arrived, his steps were a little lighter. Maybe he felt better. Maybe he was simply looking forward to the time he spent at the piano. He didn't know that his quiet routines were being carefully observed by someone who saw more potential in him than he saw in himself. As the teenager moved through the hall, sweeping and organizing, the guard watched him with a mix of respect and curiosity. He noticed small details, the care the teen used when handling delicate objects, the way he paused at the stage as if checking whether the moment was right, the subtle excitement in his eyes when he sat down at the piano. When he started playing that night, the melody was lighter, almost playful. The notes danced across the hall, making the shadows shift and sway. The guard smiled slightly, listening to the change in emotion. He pulled out his phone again and recorded another short clip, then another. Each one was just a few seconds long, but each one captured a different feeling. Later, after the teenager had gone home, the guard sat alone in the hall and replayed the recordings. Something inside him settled as he listened. He realized he wasn't recording just for himself anymore. He believed the world needed to hear this, needed to feel what he felt. But he was still unsure whether sharing the recordings was the right thing to do. Over the next few days, he could hardly think about anything else. He watched the teenager play nightly, collecting a handful of short recordings that captured the heart in the music. He never showed himself, always staying hidden, always listening. And with each night, the idea grew stronger and harder to ignore. One evening, after the teenager left, the guard sat at the staff table with his phone in his hand. He stared at the screen. The video paused at a moment where the boy's hands were moving gracefully across the keys. The sound was soft but full of emotion. The guard hesitated, but only for a moment. Then, quietly, he uploaded one of the clips. He didn't include the teenager's name. He didn't mention the location. He simply posted the video with a few simple words about a hidden talent playing in an empty hall. He didn't expect anyone to notice. He didn't expect anything to change. He only hoped the music would reach someone who needed it. Little did he know that this small action was about to create a ripple effect far bigger than either of them could imagine. The teenager continued showing up each night, unaware of what had begun. The hall felt the same to him. Quiet, comforting, familiar. But the world outside was beginning to shift. And soon, the peaceful nights he cherished would take on a life of their own. Someone had been listening. And now, others were about to hear the truth hidden in the empty seats. The video that the guard uploaded began to move quietly through the online world. It didn't explode overnight, but it started gathering attention in a gentle, steady way. People who stumbled across it were drawn in by the soft melody echoing through the empty hall. They didn't know who was playing. They didn't know where it was recorded. All they knew was that the music felt real, like someone was sharing a piece of their heart without saying a word. Comments began to appear beneath the video. Some people wrote that the sound made them feel calm after a long day. Others said it reminded them of moments they once cherished but had forgotten. A few wondered who the mysterious pianist was. The video spread slowly at first, then faster as more people shared it with their friends. Within days, it reached thousands of views. But the teenager knew nothing about any of this. To him, the world outside stayed exactly the same. He went to school in the morning, barely speaking unless necessary, went home for a short rest, and then headed out for his evening shift at the hall. His routine had not changed. He still walked through the empty building with simple steps, and he still sat at the piano each night as though the instrument were his oldest friend. The guard, however, began to notice small signs that the video was gaining momentum. People started leaving encouraging messages, asking if there were more clips. Some even asked if the pianist performed anywhere. The guard felt a strange mix of excitement and worry. He didn't want to overwhelm the teenager or expose him in a way that made him uncomfortable. But he also felt the world was hearing something special, something that deserved to grow. He continued recording short clips whenever the teenager played, always from a distance, always staying hidden. He didn't tell anyone at the hall, didn't discuss it with the manager, didn't even mention it to his family. It was something that felt too fragile to speak about loudly, like a secret that needed careful handling. One night, the teenager arrived looking more relaxed than usual. Maybe the day hadn't been as hard. Maybe he had simply grown more comfortable with his late-night routine. He moved through his tasks quickly, humming under his breath. When he finally sat at the piano, he closed his eyes for a moment, letting his thoughts settle before playing. The guard listened from his usual spot as a new melody filled the air. It was brighter than before, like sunlight breaking through clouds. The notes rose gently, then fell softly, carrying a warmth that reached into the darkest corners of the hall. The guard felt a smile tug at his lips without even thinking about it. He recorded a longer clip that night, unable to stop himself. When the teenager finished and walked off stage, the guard sat for a long moment, staring at his phone screen. He knew he had captured something beautiful, and without allowing himself too much time to reconsider, he uploaded it as well. This second video spread even faster than the first. People who had watched the first clip were eager to hear more. They shared it across different platforms, tagging friends and writing messages about how the sound made them feel peaceful, inspired, or emotional in ways they didn't expect. Some said it helped them sleep. Others said it brought back hope during stressful times. Within a week, local music pages began to notice the videos too. They didn't know who the pianist was, But the mystery only made it more intriguing. Posts began circulating with titles like "Unknown Midnight Pianist Plays with Soul" and "Hidden Talent in an Empty Hall Leaves Listeners Speechless." People speculated about everything. Was it a professional practicing after hours? A forgotten musician? A new prodigy? Still, the teenager remained unaware as he continued playing night after night. He didn't realize how much the energy in the hall had changed. He didn't notice how the guard watched him with a new kind of protectiveness. And he didn't notice how the world outside had begun searching for the person behind the music. The manager of the concert hall, however, noticed something unusual when she arrived one morning. She saw a small group of people gathered near the front entrance, looking around with curiosity. Some held their phones. Others whispered to each other while glancing at the building. She approached them, confused by the attention. When she asked if they needed help, one of them asked if the midnight pianist worked there. She had no idea what they meant. That afternoon, she looked up the videos that people mentioned. When she found them, she felt chills run through her. She recognized the hall instantly. The camera angle, even though taken from a distance, clearly captured the familiar shape of the stage. The lighting, the acoustics, there was no mistaking it. She watched the video all the way through, her heart tightening as she listened. She hadn't heard such pure emotion in that building for years. She searched for more information, but the videos gave nothing away about who the pianist was. Later that night, she stayed later than usual, walking through the hall with a quiet mind. She wondered who could be behind the music. No one on staff played the piano. The hired musicians hadn't been in the building for months, and the sound didn't match any recordings she knew. Meanwhile, the teenager arrived for his shift, not noticing the manager sitting in the balcony. He followed his normal routine, checked the trash bins, swept the aisles and wiped down the seats. Then he made his way to the stage. The manager watched from above, hidden in the shadows. The moment he sat at the piano, it clicked for her. She leaned forward slightly, recognizing him from his quiet walks around the building. She had seen him working many evenings, never drawing attention to himself. She would have never guessed he could play like this. He began to play without knowing she was there. His fingers moved gently, shaping another soft melody that filled the hall. The manager was stunned. It wasn't just talent, it was emotion poured into sound. Unbeknownst to them both, the guard stood in his usual place far below, also watching. But this time, he wasn't the only unseen listener. When the teenager finished, the manager quietly stood up and made her way down the stairs. She approached the stage slowly, not wanting to startle him. He noticed her only when she stepped into the faint circle of light. He froze, fear flashing across his face. He immediately stood up from the bench, worried he had broken some rule. But the manager didn't look angry. She looked amazed. "I've heard your music," she said softly. "The hall hasn't sounded like this in years." He didn't know what to say. His heart thumped in his chest. He wondered if she was about to fire him. Instead, she asked him to sit again. And for the first time, he played for someone he knew was listening. The guard watched from the back, his chest swelling with pride. He finally stepped out from the shadows, feeling the moment had come to reveal the truth. The hall wasn't empty anymore. Not truly. Something new had begun. Something none of them had expected. The world outside was still buzzing. People continued searching, curious to uncover the identity behind the midnight music. And now, inside the hall, the mystery was beginning to unravel. The quiet nights were changing. And what had once been a secret between a teenager and a piano was becoming something far larger. Something alive, growing, and impossible to hide. The night after the big performance, the old concert hall felt strangely lighter, as if all the years of dust, silence, and forgotten memories had finally lifted from its walls. Even the wooden floor seemed to glow a little when the light hit it. The young janitor stood at the entrance for a moment, taking everything in. He had walked through the same doorway countless times, but now it felt different. The place wasn't just a job for him anymore. Something important had happened here, something that had changed him in ways he was still trying to understand. He stepped inside quietly, almost afraid to disturb the peaceful air. The piano that had once been ignored by everyone now sat at the center of the hall like a guest of honor. A soft beam of morning sunlight fell across its polished surface. He couldn't help but smile. A few days ago, this piano had been nothing more than an old instrument tucked away in a forgotten building. But his simple habit of playing it at night had started a chain of events he never expected. He walked slowly toward the stage, feeling the wooden steps under his shoes. The echoes of the last performance still lived in his mind. The sound of applause, the faces of strangers who had been touched by his music, the way people whispered to each other afterward with bright eyes. It was almost surreal. He had never planned for any of that to happen. All he had wanted was a quiet place to play, a moment to breathe, and the comfort of the keys under his fingers. When he reached the piano, he placed his hand gently on the lid. It was cool to the touch. For a moment, he simply stood there, thinking about everything that had led him to this point. He remembered the first night he had played here, when the hall had been completely dark except for the faint glow from a single emergency light. He remembered the sound of his fingers shaking on the keys, unsure if he even deserved to play on such a stage. He remembered how the music had slowly taken over, easing his worries until he felt like he belonged. He pulled the bench out and sat down. The seat gave a small creak, familiar and comforting. He didn't open the piano just yet. Instead, he looked around the hall again, letting his thoughts drift. The place no longer felt empty. It felt alive, as if it was waiting for him. He took a slow breath and finally lifted the lid. His fingers hovered above the keys for a moment before gently pressing down the first note. The soft sound bounced off the walls, warm and pure. He let the tone fade naturally before beginning to play a gentle melody he'd never played before. It wasn't planned. It came straight from whatever he was feeling at that moment. Gratitude, disbelief, hope. As he played, the music filled the hall with a calm that wrapped around him like a blanket. It wasn't dramatic or showy. It was simple and honest, the kind of tune someone plays when they finally feel safe enough to let their heart speak. After a while, he heard the faint sound of footsteps behind him. He didn't stop playing, but his shoulders tensed just a little. It wasn't fear, just surprise. He had assumed he was alone. A quiet voice spoke from behind him. "You're here early again." He turned slightly to see the hall supervisor standing near the doorway. The man looked different too, more relaxed, like he had also been changed by the events of the last few nights. "I just wanted to play for a bit," the janitor said softly. The supervisor nodded. "You know, people are still talking about what happened. They keep asking when you'll perform again." The janitor blinked. "Me? Yes, you." The supervisor stepped closer, his shoes tapping lightly against the wooden floor. "They loved your story. A quiet worker playing in an empty hall. It meant something to them. And your music. It reached people." The janitor looked down at the keys. He didn't know what to say. The idea of performing again both scared and excited him. He never wanted attention. He never wanted to be in the spotlight. But he loved music, and he loved the feeling it brought into this old building. The supervisor sat in one of the seats close to the stage, leaning forward slightly. "You don't have to decide anything right now, but I want you to know this hall is open to you. We want you here." The young janitor felt a warm wave of emotion rise in his chest. He nodded slowly. "Thank you," he whispered. The supervisor gave a small smile and settled into the chair, closing his eyes as the janitor continued to play. The sun moved gradually across the room, brightening the rows of red seats and making the dust in the air sparkle like tiny stars. As the melody grew, something inside the janitor shifted. It wasn't confidence exactly, more like an understanding that he had found a place where he could be himself. A place that accepted him even when he wasn't trying to prove anything. He finished the piece with a soft final note and let his hands rest gently on the keys. The hall was quiet for a moment. "That was beautiful," the supervisor said. The janitor smiled a little. "Thank you." When he stood up from the bench, he felt lighter. He walked down the steps of the stage and looked around the hall one last time. He didn't know what the future would hold, whether he would perform here again, whether people would continue to care about his story, or whether this hall would become a bigger part of his life. But he knew one thing for sure. This place had changed him. And maybe, in some small way, he had changed it too. He picked up his cleaning supplies from the corner, but even those felt different in his hands. Not heavier, not embarrassing, just tools he used to care for a building that had somehow started caring for him as well. Before he left, he turned back toward the piano. For a moment, he imagined what this hall looked like years ago when it had been full of people, music, and life. Then he imagined what it might look like years from now. Maybe restored, maybe full again, maybe even hosting others who found comfort in its quiet spaces. He gave the piano a small nod, as if thanking it for everything it had given him. Then he whispered into the still air, "I'll be back." And with that, he walked toward the door, the soft echo of his footsteps trailing behind him. The sun shone a little brighter as he stepped outside, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like he knew where he belonged.